Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, one of the civic partners for our show. My guest today is Shoshana Hershkowitz, the campaign manager for the Empire State Campaign for Childcare and the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy. Shoshana, welcome back to St. Lawrence County. Welcome back to North Country Matters. Of course, you did spend time in St. Lawrence County when you were a college student, did you? Did you not?
Yes, yeah. Proud Crane graduate from SUNY Potsdam.
There you go. So the New York state budget was finally put to bed, although they certainly missed their bedtime as it was signed into law 2 months late. It was so late, in fact, that the legislature had very little time to pass bills not related to the budget. So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in this year's budget as it relates to childcare.
Okay.
All right. The budget did make some investments in childcare, including record funding for childcare assistance, pre-K, and universal childcare pilot programs. And it includes some new protections for immigrant families and some new funding for legal services. Let's go over some of those items in more detail, please.
Okay. So let's start with the Child Care Assistance Program. Um, that is a program that has been enormously successful in that people who are able to access it can pay greatly reduced or even free childcare. If you make up to $114,000 as a family of four in New York State, you qualify for child care assistance. And that is an eligibility that's been greatly expanded over the past few years. But with that expansion, the funding for that program did not keep pace with the eligibility. And over the past year, about 35 counties outside of New York City, not counting New York City, um, were running out of funding at different points and either closing enrollment, not renewing enrollment, starting wait lists, including much of the North Country. I live in Suffolk County on Long Island, same thing there. So it was really just all over the state. Families that qualified for and in many cases relied on child care assistance previously could not get either recertified or renewed. And that also disrupted the well-being of providers, people who are caring for those children and families who rely on getting paid through that system. So it's something that we spent a great deal of time advocating for beginning last year when we saw the problem starting to bubble up. It started in New York City and then was kind of gradually spreading and then really became a huge issue this year. And in the governor's executive budget, she put additional funding to the child care assistance program, which we think if the counties can act quickly, we will be able to alleviate a lot of the wait lists and closures in many of the counties outside of New York City. So we consider that to be something that is a real success. However, New York City is still a huge issue. There are 25,000 kids on that waiting list, over 25,000 at this count, growing about 1,500 kids per month. So we are continuing to advocate in New York City as the city council negotiates the budget. But in New York State, outside of the city, we are hopeful that counties will be able to act quickly and help, really stabilize the families on waiting lists or waiting for renewal and the providers who serve them. So that is a really good thing.
You know, I know that here in St. Lawrence County, we're about $1 million in arrears from the fact that the money didn't come through. And so the county has to fill that budget gap from the last time before it can start to allow new or existing families to continue to take that money. That's really a huge problem for counties because they don't have that kind of discretionary funds, do they?
No, and one of the things that, unfortunately, with this very truncated legislative session, we began to work on a piece of legislation that would, rather than this being, put over 57 counties outside of New York City, put it in one central area because we noticed that the discrepancies between the counties, both in what they spend and in the way they administer services, is vastly different. So rather than having 57 different counties administering this state system, putting it back in the state and having one
Mhm.
central system that would then make it more equitable. And as we scale up to universal childcare, make it easier to manage. So unfortunately, and that was called the Child Care Assistance Reform Act, sponsored by Sarah Clark in the Assembly and April Baskin in the Senate. We did start to meet with legislators and talk to them about it, and it was well received, started getting co-sponsors, but unfortunately, since there was very little time in this legislative session, little over a week, we were not able to see that through. So that is something we will be focusing on in the coming months as we prepare for the 2027 session.
Well, it certainly
But
makes a lot of sense that going to a universal administrative system makes more sense than 57
yeah, yeah,
administrative systems.
absolutely.
So that
And
certainly makes a lot of sense.
I mean, and one of the things we noticed over this past year is that across the state, the counties just varied so differently. I live in Suffolk County, which has been closed since November of 2025, sitting right next to Nassau County, which is open. And we found the same thing. Albany County open, Rensselaer County closed, and just across the state in different places, that was the case. So we really think that this is an important step that we'll be advocating for going forward. Another thing that did not get done because of the short amount of time, two things. One was that we talked about children with disabilities and the fact that we would like to double the enhancement rate for providers who are caring for children with disabilities, the reimbursement rate. So that was a bill sponsored by Pat Fahey in Albany and Andrew Hevesy, the chair of Children and Families in the Assembly. We're not able to get anywhere on that again because of that like deeply truncated session. And our separating work hours
Mm.
from childcare assistance, that we've called that the decoupling bill, has passed multiple times, been vetoed by the governor, was passed again in the Senate in the last day of session for the Senate on Thursday. We were hoping it would make it through the Assembly on Friday, did not. So that severely truncated session really did impact a lot of what we wanted to do, unfortunately. The Child Care Assistance Program additional funding is a win for us, something we're happy about that will really help a lot of the state, um, as well as these pilot programs in 3 counties, Broome, Duchess, and Monroe, which are pilot programs for birth to 3. Um, we are hoping that they will continue, one, to not treat these as one-offs and, one and done and do it for a couple years and then abandon that funding, but rather treat it as a launching point for expansion. And, I think that for us to really, kick the tires on universal childcare, we need to take this into rural counties. We need to take
Mhm.
this into the North Country and see, what differences need to be done here for this to be, successful and meaningful for families. So we will continue to advocate for those expansions and making sure that they get to all corners of this state.
And you know as well as I do that in a lot of rural New York are childcare deserts. So they
Yep,
really, really need to have some attention focused on making sure that these rural areas can provide the childcare that is absolutely needed for the workforce to be able to go to work.
absolutely. Yeah. And then, unfortunately for the second year in a row, there was no like wage enhancement for the childcare workforce. And it really is an issue because we've heard this governor talk about universal childcare, but part of the reason we have such severe shortages in childcare deserts across the state is because it is not a career people feel like they can make a living in. When you make 36 to $38,000 a year, you cannot care for your own family. So if we are truly going to establish universal childcare in the state, we are going to have to make this a profession that people can make a living in and care for their own family while caring for other people's children. So, we are continuing the struggle, trying to figure out how we can, really recruit the workforce that we need to make universal childcare a reality in New York State.
And that's going to come down to dollars and cents because if you can't make a living, it's not a viable occupation, is it?
No, no. And I think that it's such an important profession. One, in, what it provides economically, the stability it provides for families so that they can go to work and know their children are safe and nurtured, but also just for the well-being of young children. We spend so much time in K through 12 trying to, address issues that if they are addressed in early childhood when brain development is at its peak, you prevention costs a lot less than correction. And I think that if we're trying to be fiscally responsible in this state, one of the best things you can do is invest in kids early and give them what they need and set them up for success rather than trying to counteract problems later.
And the Annie Casey Foundation just came out with their Kids Count data release, and it shows that New York State ranks about 30th overall in the nation, but we rank about 46th, and that's at the bottom, in support
Yeah.
of economic well-being. Child poverty ranks 38th, housing affordability ranks 46th. We're doing okay with healthcare, but we're missing out on all of those other economic factors that you were just talking about, which are so critical to having successful children grow into successful adults.
And the truth is that New York is a wealthy state. We have the resources to do so much better for our kids. This really comes down to being a policy choice. It is not a lack of means. It is I think too often a lack of political will to do big things.
Well, as we both know, budgets are statements of values.
Yeah.
And what we put our money into is what we care about when we're talking about governments. So the other win for childcare was more protection for immigrant families. Talk a little bit about that, because that is a group of people who have been so under the gun in the last couple of years on the federal side of things.
Absolutely. And I think that the protections that have been put in place, while they fall short of the recommendations of the New York for All, which, we have been in support of, the fact that it is going to be, both the providers and the families they serve, that the sensitive locations that are
Mhm.
schools is incredibly important. And at the federal level, there is an act called the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act, but given the political winds of Washington right now is not a reality. So being able to enact that at the state level, that these are places where parents should not be afraid to drop off their children at school for
Mhm.
fear that they will be taken by ICE or their children won't come home to a parent. That's incredibly important. And we're glad that they did that. I believe, there is more that could be done with New York for All. And certainly the fact that they are, getting rid of 287G agreements, which is something I believe 7 counties in the state have been cooperating with, including Nassau County on Long Island. Um, these are things that will certainly make it better and easier and safer for immigrants, though it does fall short of what New York for All, what that legislation would have done.
Yeah, the league supported New York for All as well. And of course, it isn't just immigrant families. When ICE is raiding schools, all children are under stress. And they wonder,
Absolutely.
am I next? Because you don't have any way to know that, especially if you're a young child. So
Yeah.
we had hoped that the budget would protect families from the full impact of federal cuts and rising costs. But that didn't happen, did it? What will that lack
No.
of funding mean for New York families, especially those with young children?
I think that people will continue to struggle. They're being squeezed in every direction. They're being squeezed, in their rising taxes as far as, just income taxes, their, property taxes. Those school budgets go up every year. Um, they are being squeezed in their rising premiums for healthcare, grocery store, utilities, gas prices, and, you know, a rebate check for a couple $100s isn't going to fix that. It really requires robust government investment. And, while healthcare is not the area I focus on, the fact that, those folks on the essential plan are going to, lose their healthcare. These are really frightening things. And unfortunately, I think that we haven't seen the worst of it.
No,
Which is really, really alarming because people are struggling right now.
right. And we're talking about they're talking about cutting WIC funding.
Yep.
Families are being thrown out of SNAP and Medicaid. this affects children. It affects families. It adds to the stress. Talk about not investing in early intervention. As you say, those problems are only going to multiply if they are not addressed at an early stage. So
Yeah.
we know the budget failed to help cushion those repeated blows we've seen from those essential services. New York families are being pinched and pinched hard. And as you say, more hardships are coming down the road. And once again, our budget leaders fail to take bold action to support childcare workforce, which is one of the lowest paid occupations in New York State. You've talked about what the campaign wanted to do to attract and keep these essential workers. How on earth are we going to be able to do that? Because without the state investing, the daycare centers, the child care centers, and the mom and pop operations can't do it all by themselves, can they?
No, no, they can't. And I think that we're going to have to continue to really push and to make this case. And I think the other thing is that if parents and providers in every corner of the state can share their stories, that's going to be very, very important, whether that is with legislators, with the media. Just today, again, I live on Long Island, and we had a childcare provider and parent talk about like their struggle, and the parent just had twins about a year ago, can't go back to work full time because they can't afford the childcare. The childcare provider is struggling to make ends meet, and in an effort to keep the families and to pay their staff, but sometimes not paying themselves. So you're seeing that like this free market solution to childcare is failing everybody. And Long Island is a place with an extremely high cost of living in this state. And, I think that those problems, it may play out a little differently in a suburban area, but the problem is the same throughout the state. And unless we see government step in and really put the resources in to address the problem, not in half measures, not in drips and drabs, then this will continue to be pervasive, no matter what part of the state you live in.
I was just reading that Mayor Mondami in New York City just is prepared to open a free childcare center. It's only going to be for 35 kids, but it's for city workers, and it's kind of a pilot project. And this is something that he talked about when he was running for election. Really, workplaces could be a big part of the solution if they would provide home site-based childcare to keep those workers employed, because it comes down to affordability. If you can't afford to work because you can't afford childcare, where do the workers come from?
Yeah, yeah, and we really need to understand that, just that example of what Mayor Mamdani is doing is you know, that is possible everywhere,
Mhm.
and but I think it's going to take the city and the state working together, or the county or the town and the state. I think that every municipality relies on state dollars to make it work. So I think that we're going to have to, really make sure that that partnership establishes like ways for people locally to make it work for them, because obviously New York City's the way it would do it would look different than the North Country. But it's a great solution. It's a great way to, it's a good government measure. And
Yeah,
we need more of that right now in a time when, I think people don't always think that government can deliver for them. And we want to show that it can and it should.
yes, I agree. And maybe these three state county partnerships with early for uh oh, what universal
It's
child
like,
care, the pilots, excuse me.
yeah, yeah,
If
yeah.
we can't just stop at three. We've got to
Yep.
make sure, we got to see if they work. We've got to expand them, and then people will start believing again. Because I know locally, people have said, "Well, the CCAP money failed me because we didn't get it. I'm not even going to bother to apply." Or we've got providers who say that's such a disappointment. We just can't rely on it. We need
Yeah,
programs that people can rely on, and funding streams that are there for small businesses, because that's what childcare centers are small businesses, and they need that help.
absolutely.
If
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, again, this is a state that is wealthy, has the resources. So it's just a question of, in a $269 billion budget, what are our priorities? And you know, if we don't have enough to meet it, we've talked, the governor herself has said it will take raising revenue for a funding stream for childcare, you know, and what is that revenue raiser going to be? I know that they had talked about, starting like a work group or a, task force to identify that. We're a year later and we still don't have that answer, even though, there's certainly been reports written, there's certainly
Mhm.
plenty of data and information where these decisions could be made. So we have to stop kind of, waffling and kicking the can down the road. People need these things now and they need them to show up in their lives and make a material difference.
That's right. You can sign a bill, but that doesn't make it happen, does it? And
Yeah.
that's what we've
Yeah. So
seen.
much of the implementation. Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many challenges to implementation that just have seem to have stumped the folks who have created the legislation and who've signed the legislation, yet it still isn't being implemented the way we want it to be, is it?
Yeah. And that's where I think people need to really, government needs to listen to the people who are living and in the work because no one knows better what the North Country needs than the people who live in the North Country. You know, so for someone, from Albany to say, well, this is how it's going to work there, those are two different parts of the state, and the way things play out are different simply because of the geography and the population. So, while the problem is the same in Albany and Long Island and the North Country, the way those solutions are enacted will look different. And
Uh,
that's okay. And that's where, I think state and local governments work together and create, the model that fits the community.
So, Shoshana, tell me, do you think we moved any closer to real universal childcare in New York State with this budget? Real universal childcare, which you and I have been talking about now for several years.
Um, I think we made some baby steps, but that is not enough.
Okay.
And I think that we can celebrate the fact that these wait lists will outside of New York City will likely be drawn down. We can celebrate these pilots, but that is really just scratching the surface for
Right.
what we need.
Yeah, so we need shovels,
Yeah.
not forks. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is going to require resources.
mhm.
And I think that government in a state like New York needs to be stop being so averse to saying things cost money. These are public goods,
They
and
are
people's
public
lives
goods.
will be better for them. So we need to rip the Band-Aid off and say like
And
this is
and
what government is for.
and this is exactly what the Casey Foundation's Kids Count says. It's not enough to say, oh, you're doing good in healthcare, but you're failing in economic areas. We need to look at the whole system because if we don't take care of our young people now, they're not going to be able to be the productive citizens that we need them to be 10, 20 years down the road when we're looking to them for policy solutions. If they keep thinking that they've been failed by government, why would they go into government and hope to make a positive difference?
Absolutely. And people don't live their lives in silos.
That's right.
If, a child's doing okay on healthcare, but they don't have enough to eat, they don't identify those. Well, those are two different funding streams in the budget. A hungry kid is a hungry kid, and a kid without a home is, people don't live their lives in silos, and we need to recognize that and treat the problem holistically rather than these little piecemeal things.
That's exactly right. So, what do the child care advocates need to do going forward? Because we've got 6 months until the next legislative session. So, and we have no idea if that budget is not going to eat up all of the 6 month session again. It could, because once you start down this road, what's the incentive to go back to an on-time budget? We haven't had one in 5 years. So we need
Yeah.
to find a way for the legislature to work effectively and the governor not to say at the end of the year, well, I don't like this bill, I'm not going to sign it, because that's what's happening now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we saw some frustration from the legislature and from the leadership. So I'm curious to see if they change the way they do business, because
Mhm.
certainly, you heard Speaker Heastie say we're never doing this again, and we'll see how he feels in January. Um, But I think in the coming months, we will try to be working with our local partners to make sure that these wait lists are cleared. We will be working on the implementation of the pilots in those three counties and making sure that they're done in a way that really is equitable. We'll also be working to grow support and educate the legislature about the Child Care Assistance Reform Act, about reimbursement rates for those with who are doing early intervention or serving kids with special needs. And then I think we'll also be really talking about how do we, make the case for the recruiting a child care workforce. Because I think that, we have talked about permanent funding streams, and the legislature seems to be on board, but it seems to continue to fall out of the final budget. So we need to really think about where can we make some strides here, because this is a workforce that cannot afford to wait.
No, it can't. And I want to remind folks that 2026 is a state election this
Yes, so
fall.
you've got your
And that
entire state government up for reelection.
That's right. And in many cases, for the first time in a long time, people are going to have choices because it's not just incumbents running with no challenges. So if you really take a look at what your legislator has done, and if they have not met your needs, you have a chance to give them a failing grade or a passing grade on election day. So think about
Yeah,
that, because it's the only way we as citizens really have to affect change, is to change who we send to Albany or to Washington, as the case may be. And we've been failed by a lot of our current leadership, sadly, and a lot of our current legislators, because they've allowed this system not to work. They didn't kick up a fuss when they went to a 2-month budget overtime cycle. So we need to kick up a fuss and get their attention.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, as always, Shoshana, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk about these things. Someday, what I would like to do is people say, well, this was the session when we finally got what we needed, but I'm afraid that we're going to have to keep going back to work, aren't we?
Yeah, and I one thing I want to say is to anyone who's listening who has made those trips to Albany or made those trips to their legislator's office, who has shared their story, you are so appreciated. This is hard work. It is a multi-year fight, and I know that it's draining. And I know that it's draining to share your story again and again and to keep asking for what you should just have because it should be a public good. So I thank you and I appreciate you. And the campaign really appreciates the work of everyday people who are putting up a really good fight.
They really are. And the truth is that real advocacy is about telling your story, because you
Yeah,
can throw numbers and statistics at people all day long, but it doesn't make the emotional connection that your story makes. And so don't get tired of telling your story, because you're right. It is the one thing that is the most likely to work.
yeah, yeah, very much so.
Well, Shoshana, thanks again for coming in. It's always a pleasure. We will be having you back because we have
Yeah,
more work to do, my friend.
indeed. Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So these conversations are a production of North Country Matters. This show is a civic collaboration between the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next year, till next time, remember the North Country matters, your vote matters, and you have a chance to grade your legislators this fall. Don't fail to do it. Thank you.